Welcome to the Brand Fortress HQ podcast. This is another Amazon Tactics Tuesday, and actually we're going to do something a little bit different today. Rather than talking about Amazon and e-commerce, we're actually going to take you behind the scenes to talk about the launch of our podcast. So I've got Matt with me, I've got Mike with me, and I guess let's start off, I'll start with you guys and just, we've been talking about this for a while before we actually launched it. What interested you guys the most in launching a podcast?
You want to start, Matt?
So if we go back even farther than that, how this whole thing started to begin with, if you remember, John, you and I met I was working for an agency, and you came as a prospect, and that turned into, we got along really well. We had some conversations. Those conversations got more regular. After a year later, we ended up inviting Mike to the conversations, and I mean, we've been having these conversations for over 2 years now, and when, I don't remember if it was you or Mike, which one of you said, hey, we should probably record some of these because we talk about some pretty high level stuff. And I mean, it really hasn't changed, to be honest. Like, it really still feels like you and I, us three getting together and nerding out on our businesses. To me, the fact that we're actually recording it for a podcast it's cool, but like, it started out just as an organic conversation between a bunch of buddies. And I think that's why I enjoy the whole process of this podcast so much, is because it basically is now a better produced convo with some of my really good friends.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's nice. And I think, from the standpoint of people listening, obviously if that's not already happening, that maybe doesn't help you much. And also I think there's probably the aspect of, for most individuals who are listening, who are likely Amazon sellers, that, a podcast for you, unless you intend on maybe getting into consulting or things of that nature, in the space, that it's more likely that a podcast that's surrounded by the topics that would be of interest to your customers would be the thing that would be most valuable, in terms of promoting your business and getting more exposure for your brand and that sort of thing. So it's a little bit different animal than what we're doing. But by the same token, there's probably something to learn from that, in the sense that, there's probably value in you finding some individuals that operate in your space, not necessarily product sellers, although it could be, but, like, for instance, we sell pool tools. For me to just have regular conversations, make some connections with individuals who are pool pros that have been doing this for a long time, and just have regular conversations with them, like every couple of weeks or every week or something, right? Get comfortable, find somebody that you're comfortable having those conversations with, and that you can have some relatively kind of high level conversations about that topic, so like in our case, pool maintenance and, things of that nature, right? Like, they understand the space in a much different way than I understand the space. But not only would those conversations help me to understand the space better, but if we get good at that conversation, then that can easily just turn naturally into a podcast that's of benefit to both of you, right? Because then you can serve customers in that space. You already kind of know how to have those conversations. It would be, as Matt said, much more organic, and it would probably give you a lot more confidence to step into that opportunity of actually doing a podcast, if you've been having those conversations all along and now you're just deciding to record them, right? There would be it's a low hanging fruit option, right? See if you can connect somebody with somebody else in the space that you can just have some of those higher level conversations with.
Yeah, and I would say, even going from there and kind of what spurred this on was being on other people's podcasts. All three of us have been on different podcasts involved in Amazon, and just, for the most part, the people that you have those podcasts with, I feel like, at least, they're usually a lot of fun as far as the conversation. And no matter, whether you're selling a product on Amazon or, you're running an agency or doing, providing some other type of service, getting on a podcast really is a great way to have, a way to tell your story, and you get a couple of different things out of it. I mean, the first thing is that, obviously you've got the recorded conversation. I feel like everybody, or a lot of people now, podcasts are great because it's kind of a passive way of getting information, where, you listen to your car when you're driving into work or whatever it happens to be. But then also, in the content aspect, there's that long form, but also, you can take a lot of these assets that you get from a podcast, because most of them, like the platform that we're using right now is Riverside, so it records video as well. And then you get some video aspect of it, and then you can chop that up into clips that then can be posted, social media and all that type of stuff. So from a content perspective, it's absolutely fantastic. And then, again, on top of it, I think this whole process, as we've launched this podcast, of hosting a podcast, has definitely been, first of all, it's been a lot of fun. Secondly, I think that if somebody's like, hey, I want to get, see what that looks like to get my feet wet, being on a podcast, something in your category, your industry, whatever it happens to be. And in fact, we have something that we're going to have coming out here in a few weeks, where we're going to start bringing on some brand builders as an example. So that way you can kind of hear their stories and their journeys and learn from what they've been doing. And I think that that's a great place to start, because there's so much value in that content. And then if you're like, hey, I really enjoy this, starting your own podcast is definitely something to consider. Not going to be perfect for everybody in every industry, but there's definitely a lot of, it's an easy way to connect with people. And well, I'm not going to say an easy, because it's not super easy, but I would say it's a good way to connect. I can see, for those that don't see the video right now, Mike's got a big smile on his face because
I'm glad that John took the reins on this and put in all the effort, because if it had to be me, we would not be in the position right now.
So yeah, I mean, it's a great way to generate content, is really the short answer. Whether it's being on a podcast, and then of course it's a whole new level when you decide that you want to host your own podcast.
Well, and just from the nuts and bolts of it, right? I mean, being on any podcast, or say hopefully multiple podcasts before you start your own, the nuts and bolts of what that process could look like, in terms of, what sort of questions might you ask on a questionnaire for somebody that you might interview for your podcast? What should those questions look like? How should that process work? Should you do a pre-interview? Should you, all of those things, if you're getting interviewed on podcasts that have been established and have done maybe, say, at least 50 or 100 episodes, maybe, right? They probably have streamlined their process enough that it would be useful, to see how do they do it? Like, what is the process? How do they run through it? So that you at least have a high level view of what that looks like. Because if you've never done it and you've never been on a podcast, you literally have no idea, what that looks like. And it would be extremely intimidating, to walk into that and to have never experienced it at all from either side of the mic. So yeah, I absolutely agree. The best thing to do would be just be on some podcast, see if you can be interviewed as, an expert or a brand builder or whatever, find something that you think you could talk about effectively for, 20 or 30 or 40 minutes, and see who might interview you about that,
Well, if you're a brand builder and you're looking at like, how does this relate to me? And even if it's just you finding a podcast to be on that is in your target market, even if you use that as kind of being a reporter and asking questions to someone that purchases your product. Like, Mike, you don't even own a pool and you sell pool cleaning tools. So if you're having a conversation with a pool cleaning technician or someone that owns a shop that sells this kind of stuff, like, you'll learn a lot just by asking him questions or by answering, him asking you questions about your business and your products. Like, you would learn so much more about your target market, which then you can use in so many other ways, even if it's just using that knowledge to understand how to speak to your consumer a little bit better. So, I mean, there's so many different benefits to it, but like learning who your target market is and what's important to them, that's one of the biggest, if you're just a brand builder and you're not looking to build content for any other reason, just by understanding them a little bit better.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think the other thing is that I think is important, at least in this process, or at least was for me, is that, first of all, these were conversations that we were already having at a high level. And what I like about having the podcast now is that it really just provides, I think, a better platform for us to be able to get that content, whether it be in audio form, video form, whatever, out to sellers that are looking at fortifying their brand and looking at how do I continue to grow on Amazon and beyond, in a way that, um, other mediums or other strategies or approaches may not be as easy in order to share. So, for me, at least, that was one of the big reasons why I was excited about doing the podcast, is because I think it's just such a good medium to have, quite frankly, the conversations that we were already having.
Well, and there's such great tools out there, right? Like, I mean, we use Riverside, but there's a number of other tools out there for doing a podcast that essentially accomplish many of the same goals. Like they help with the audio and they do things like that. But honestly, like you said, in terms of content, in terms of the shorts that it generates and the scripts and transcripts and things like that you can use in so many different ways. Like even us, I mean, essentially, we really have just started this podcast. I mean, it didn't launch that long ago, and you know even though it takes some time, to get some traction, if you look at the YouTube shorts that we're publishing, already, we've got, I don't know what, a couple thousand views or something like that, if you
Yeah.
add it all up, and so, if you think about that, depending on what it is you're trying to accomplish, that's actually fairly impressive. The number of people that we've already reached in a very short period of time. We didn't know anything about this process. We didn't really, had not any one of us really used YouTube Shorts or TikTok or anything like that in any large capacity, previously to understand well what that process looks like. We're learning as we go, but we've already generated some traffic and some exposure, and you don't ever know, those videos, like you might publish on one platform, say you publish it on YouTube, and you get 10 views, but the very same video published to TikTok might get 15,000 or 20,000 or 100,000 reviews. So if you're taking that content and you're dispersing it and repurposing it on multiple platforms, the chance that you're going to get some decent exposure from certain ones of those videos on certain platforms is actually very good. And the content's already there. Like these services like Riverside, they already create the content for you. It makes it fairly simple. And if you just repurpose it, that alone is going to get you far more exposure than you can get without it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other thing that's important for folks to know too is that as we started talking about this, well, probably like last August. So, it was probably a total of 6 months from the time that we had talked about, said, yeah, we were interested in doing a podcast until we actually launched it. Now, I think a part of that is because all three of us, have our own, other projects and businesses and that type of thing that we do outside of, Brand Fortress HQ, which is fantastic from the standpoint of the different perspective and information that we're able to bring to the table. When we have these Tactics Tuesday talks and everything else that we do. But with that, also, I think it's important for people to know that we did bring in, somebody that actually I was on their podcast. I emailed, probably about 10 people that I knew ran, fairly successful podcasts, and just asked them for advice. And I think it's, within the Amazon community, I think we're fortunate enough to have a pretty open community where people are willing to, help each other. And I think the same thing is true for the podcast community, where, you reach out and ask for, hey, we're looking at launching a new podcast. What are your recommendations for, finding guests and, what's involved in the launch process and that type of stuff. And there was a lot of valuable advice from that. And also from that, we found somebody that, he runs, I think Brian's got 4 or 5 different podcasts, but then he also, consults for launching podcasts. And so, he really helped us, understand, just like there's an algorithm on Amazon, Apple has their own algorithm for podcasts and how that ranking works and all those types of things, and kind of helped us understand what's involved in that process and speaking that language. So that way, as we strategized, launching our podcast, we could think about, how do we want to launch the podcast in order to be as effective as possible.
I mean, imagine how much farther along he got us by his knowledge, his experience doing something that we wanted to do. He'd already done it 1,000 times, and I mean, we launched, and I mean, we were in the top 200 rankings in the first week. So I mean, like, I don't know that we would have been able to do that ourselves if we fumbled around. I mean, sure, we would have gotten it recorded. We might have landed on a program like Riverside, but I don't know that we would have been as successful right out of the gate. So, I mean, that speaks to the importance of coaches and consultants and people that have been there before to help get you there a lot faster and with a lot less mistakes, you know?
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. I mean, we made it. I mean, you say within the top 200. I mean, literally, and this is um, a little frustrating because we were so close, but we hit like 103. Like we were number
Mm-hmm.
103 briefly,
we,
right?
we
Like,
were 102, and
okay,
I'm glad you were a
102,
little
right?
frustrated. I was, it's one of those things where I'm really happy. I love the progress that we've made with the podcast, but that is one of the things that I look back and when I say, okay, what could we have done differently? I wish we would have put a little bit, and we put a lot of effort into launch, and we can talk about that in a minute, but I wish we would have been able to just get to that tipping point to get in the top 100 because we were so close in the US. We hit
And that's such a
102.
big thing, right? Like, I mean, you hit that top 100, then of course, then you get featured, and then you get like, we were just like this, like we were that close. So it's possible. I think it's, I mean, I think the big takeaway from that, for me is, and for anybody listening, number one, it's possible. Like there's a process that you could use that we used that will get you there. Like you could do it. We didn't quite make it, but a lot of other podcasts might have. Um, and like Matt said, having the benefit of that person who's gone before you 1,000 times, right? And they know what that looks like. I mean, that truly is invaluable. And I will say this much, that I really just started, kind of attending conferences and networking with other Amazon sellers and other e-commerce individuals and whatnot, literally like a year and a half ago. I mean, and in that amount of time, previous to that, I was strictly lone wolf. I didn't talk to anybody. I barely even knew, like, I knew technically that there were other Amazon sellers out there, obviously. I didn't know a single one, up until that point. And I'd been selling on Amazon for what, 8 years at that point? The amount of benefit there has been to my business in that year and a half, in terms of the number of people that I've met, the things that I've learned, the contacts that I've made, the networking and how they're able to put me in touch with people. They've already walked through a certain process that I'm about to walk through. And so I need, assistance. I can't even describe the amount of benefit that there has been to me from that process. This being one of those things. Like if I hadn't gone to that one conference, I wouldn't have met Matt. I wouldn't have been brought into your guys' little mastermind. I wouldn't hit, like, none of this would have happened, right? So that one contact, that one conference that I went. And so on the same, along that same vein, you can orchestrate that. You can pay for that right to have access to those individuals who have gone before you, who know what you're about to do, who know the pitfalls, who know the things to do right, and the things that matter and the things that don't matter. The question is, are you willing to spend the money to gain that expertise without having to go through all of the headaches that they went through? Like, that's worth thousands of dollars easily. And the question is, are you willing to pay that price? We chose to do so, to take advantage of that opportunity. And I think it's propelled us forward to a much greater degree than we would have otherwise.
So that was BDSS in Austin that you and I met. Was that your first conference that you went to, Mike?
Yes. That was
So
I went to I had a virtual BDSS before that, but I had never been to a physical, event.
So for the cost of that ticket, do you think that you could put a monetary number on how much that one trip has benefited your business since, because of all the different dominoes that has happened since then?
1,000x.
Yeah.
And that's not an exaggeration. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
literally 1,000. I mean, because I spent what, like, I don't know, $5,000, whatever it was.
Hmm.
I mean, it was pricey. I mean, and at the
Yeah.
time I was like, I don't know, but
Yeah.
I had spent, I don't know, $1,000 or whatever it was on the virtual event, and there was a lot of good content. And and I met some people. I mean, a virtual event is tough, like you're not really meeting face to face. It's Zoom, whatever. But I did meet some people through that, and it wasn't just the content that caused me to decide to go to the in-person event. Part of it was people that I met, but most of it was the content. Honestly, like there was just some really good content. But once I attended that physical event and met all of the amazing individuals that I met there, then it became clear to me that the content was valuable, but the networking and the individuals that I met, way more valuable. And I can
Yeah.
literally say that $5,000 or whatever it was that I spent on BDSS, absolutely 1,000x. I have gained more than what I put in, because I know where I'm going to be a year from now or so, based on the things that I've learned and the people that I've connected with and the stuff that I've been able to do that I didn't do before that. I have no question that that's true.
Yeah, and I think, coming back to the podcast, that's what one of the things that really excited me about it initially, and one of the things that I really enjoy about it is, you talk about contacts. I mean, we've already had some incredible, heavyweights in the Amazon space that are fantastic at moving brands forward and really know at a deep level what's happening on Amazon, and helping brands grow. And we're going to have more of those guests. We're going to have more people that are, those brand builders and that type of stuff. And the podcast just really gives, I think, a great platform in order to have a 45-minute or an hour conversation with them where everybody wins. I learn a ton from those guests. We get them some exposure with our podcast, and at the same time, you the listeners also get essentially a one-on-one session with them of what's happening in the Amazon space and what they're seeing in order to move brands forward, and your business forward on Amazon and beyond. So I think there's just an incredible amount of value that's gained through that entire process.
Well,
And
and it's
again,
funny
the
too,
brand,
because
the
go ahead,
go
Matt.
ahead, Mike.
No, I was just going to say,
The putting
all right, Matt, you're first.
putting the brand builder hat on again for our brand builders that are listening. How to apply this to your business. I sell in the barbecue accessory space, and we have a pretty big Facebook group, and weekly we used to have interviews where we would have a video interview with one of the members of the group and they would be in their backyard at the grill telling us what they were cooking up. And that was one of the things that created so much engagement in that group. But it gave us the opportunity I do love to barbecue, but I'm not a competition pit master that travels the country in these competitions, but yet we were able to have conversations with them. So we learned, we got in front of our target audience who were drawn to us because we were interviewing these people that they go to competitions and see and know because they were on TV shows. But like that was also content for us in our brand that we were able to use on all different types of advertisement, like our listing and our Facebook page and that kind of stuff. So that's how there's so many benefits of being able, just being the reporter in your category of products that you sell products in, and have that as as stuff that you can use for all of your advertisements is another really, really good application for something like this.
Well, and that's also so cool because, if you think about that, like there are a lot of different ways to run a podcast, right? It doesn't have to be a formal interview kind of a situation where, okay, you're interviewing the expert, whatever, and it doesn't have to be that. It can be that. A lot of podcasts are that, but certainly there's plenty of podcasts that's not, the structure of how it works. You could literally be like guy on the street kind of a thing, talking to individuals, in your, like you were talking about, Matt, like that whole idea of just going and being there, while the pitmaster is cooking up his stuff, at a competition or whatever. Like that could be your podcast. Like literally, you could do that and have that could be a podcast. You could still record it. You could still cut it up into shorts. You can still, create a little 20-minute thing. Like there's so many creative ways that you can do that. And again, as long as you're providing value in the space, and let's loop that back to a brand owner who maybe is trying to sell a product, or something on Amazon, right? There's, who your customer is, the things that would potentially be of value to them, the information that they would appreciate or that they would think was humorous or they would enjoy. Like it doesn't just have to be information. Like people appreciate good information and useful information, but plenty of people just go to a comedy show because they just want to be entertained, right? They scroll through TikTok because they want to be entertained, right? So your podcast could just simply be entertaining in that space. And as long as you're entertaining people that you're trying to connect with, it still gives you more exposure in that space. So, be creative with that. And in terms of, like John was talking about the fact that we've had that opportunity to bring some pretty heavy hitters in the Amazon space onto our podcast, even though realistically our podcast was pretty new, didn't really have much in the way of viewership yet, right?
We didn't. Well, I mean, as a part of the launch, we record 10 episodes before we even launch. So
precisely, right?
We are asking these people, to spend an hour with us, being very upfront that like, hey, we don't have, technically anybody yet.
Right.
Because we recorded 10 episodes before we launched.
So there was no assurance to them that they were actually going to receive any significant return on their investment of that time, right? And yet they were still willing to do so. Now, many of the people that we reached out to were people that we knew or, we had some sort of connection with, not all of them, but many of them. So that's a little bit different story, like people that are going to be willing, a little more willing to somebody that you don't. But I do think that most of the individuals listening to this would be surprised at the number of experts in your space that, one, would be flattered that you even asked them to do an interview, two, would be certainly happy to do so for the possibility of some increase in exposure, right? Because you don't know, any podcast could blow up. You don't know what podcasts are going to blow up and what podcasts aren't going to blow up, right? So being interviewed on a particular podcast, you really don't know as the expert, like maybe this is going to get me 1 million exposures. Maybe it's going to get me 0, right? But the other thing that was interesting is I spoke to another guy who runs a very, popular podcast. I'm not going to give out the name necessarily, but, he made a very good point to me. And that is that he chooses to be on virtually any podcast that somebody asks him to be on. Small or large, doesn't matter how big their audience is, whatever, as long as it's in a field that makes sense, for what he's trying to accomplish. He will accept every single podcast, every single offer, and will actually even sometimes seek out opportunities to be on a podcast. And he said something very profound, which what he said was, because you don't know what's going to happen with that podcast. Most podcasts, even if they only have done, say 10 or 15 or 20 episodes, right? They have a certain number of listeners that are already paying attention, and they will likely have more. Many of them will give up. Many of them will throw up their hands and say, you know what, I've done 40 episodes, I'm done, right? Or 30, or whatever it is.
40, they don't even get that far. I think the chasm for podcasts is something like 90% of podcasts don't make it to the 90-day mark.
Okay, so let's think about that. And this is what he said though. He said, if you've done an interview on that podcast, and there is somebody who was listening to that podcast and found it interesting, right? They probably listened to your episode. Now this podcast doesn't exist anymore. Well, what happens? The person who was listening to that podcast now has a half hour or an hour slot in their day that they used to fill with that podcast, and now they don't have anything to fill it with, right? What are they going to do? They're going to look for another podcast to fill that space with. What's the easiest way for them to do that? Go through the people that were interviewed that they thought were interesting that maybe have a podcast, and they probably heard the episode. They heard that he has a podcast. He has an opportunity to actually increase the listenership of his podcast just simply by having been on podcasts that fall away and don't have any more, like those viewers have to have some place to go. So he was just like, no, I'm going to take every opportunity I can. If I've got the time, I'm going to be on the podcast. So if you think you can't get people, to interview and to be on your podcast, you're probably wrong. I think you could.
Yeah, and I want to double down on that because I'm pretty sure that the person you're referring to, Mike, is not the same person that I'm thinking of, and I've had at least a couple of people say that to me that essentially almost any podcast offer that they get, they say yes to because it's
Yeah.
just it's such an easy win for everybody involved in the process. And I think the other important piece, just to double click on what you said there, which is you roll the dice every time you have an episode to where something could really just take off. But it may never take off. And that's okay in the sense of, if you keep hitting base hits, you're still going to get plenty of points across the plate. And, that's kind of how I view it in the sense of, we've already had some episodes that have been, essentially home runs, maybe not massive home runs of being, Joe Rogan or something like that, but really have been fantastic information that I know that listeners are going to get a lot of value out of, and that compounds over time. So, I don't even think. Listen, I'll definitely take something that an episode that really takes off and gets a bunch of listeners and gets people's attention. But at the same time, you don't even necessarily need to be massive as far as your podcast, your listeners, if you're really focused on serving a particular community.
Yeah, agreed. Something else too that just came to mind, and that is, like going back to that idea of just, being on other people's podcasts and the benefit of that, of that practice, is you also don't ever know who's going to listen to that episode. And if the right person hears that episode, that person might make a connection with you that they never would have made, previous, because they hadn't heard of you, they didn't know who you were, but maybe they find whatever it was that you said interesting and useful, and they decide they want to have you on their podcast, and maybe they have 1 million listeners, or they want to be on your podcast, because of the content that you're producing, or that so you just don't know what connection you're going to make. And again, every one of those podcast interviews, whether you're being interviewed or whether you're having somebody on and making that connection with somebody, is another opportunity to network with that person and connect with potentially all of the people that they're connected with. Why would you not take advantage of that? You're going to learn something anyways. So you take an hour of your time, even if none of those other things happen, chances are you still learned something through that interview and through that opportunity, whether you were being interviewed or whether you were interviewing somebody. I would take that every day of the week.
Or you added one other layer in your network, which could be just as valuable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think also just to me, it's so interesting how much parallels there has been with launching this podcast to any other to launching a product on Amazon, or really any of the e-commerce platforms when we talk about a logarithm, where we were fortunate enough and did some good outreach where we were featured by Kevin King and we were featured by John Durkitz, in their newsletter. So we were able to get some traction there. And then we had a pretty good process. We did a giveaway and that type of stuff in order to really get people excited about the podcast. And I think all those things together, I mean, I think in the first, couple of weeks, we had 500 downloads. So, that's 500 episodes that people listen to, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, let's face it, it's just like with anything else. We talk about this all the time, but if you're going to sell a product, sell a good one. If make sure it's something that actually helps people, that makes their lives better. Like why bother selling a product if that's, if all you're about is money, if that's the only thing that you're about, then you're not going to make very much of it. Just, straight up, it's just not going to happen. People will figure you out. They will figure out that you have no interest in helping them, that you're not out to make their lives better. You're just out to take their dollar and put it into your pocket, and they will stop buying from you. So, if you're going to produce a product, produce a good one and help people. Well, same thing here. If you're going to produce a podcast, don't do it just because it's going to get you something in return, whether that's more product sales or more exposure or whatever. Think about it as you should, which is it's an opportunity for me to contribute something to other people out there that will make their lives better. They'll learn something, or they'll laugh, or that, it'll improve their day in some way, right? So whether it's you interviewing somebody else and giving them the opportunity to say important things to the people who listen to your, podcast, or you're being on another podcast, hopefully you're presenting useful information or something that somebody's going to want or need, or that's going to make their life better. And if you pursue it in that way, like, I really just don't feel like you can lose. I mean, at the end of the day, even if you don't make any more money, even if you don't sell anything more, you still gave out some good information and somebody probably benefited from it. So, take it as a win.
Yeah, I could just said it any better. I think, that's a really good way to, I think, kind of wrap up this episode, is just focused on thinking about how you can serve your customers and your community. Anything else you want to add, Matt, before we wrap?
No, I mean, when we started having these conversations, I never thought in a million years that it would turn into a podcast, but it's a lot of fun. And like I said, I don't think there's any scenario with you as a brand builder. I think that regardless of if you think so or not, a podcast is probably a good idea for your niche and to help get the word out about your brand. So I would think about it.
And it's not easy, but it's probably easier than you think.
Yeah.
It certainly is not easy, but if you do it right and you connect with the right people who know what they're doing so they can give you a roadmap, I think the process is probably way easier than you think it is, or at least it can be if you do it right. And as long as you stick with it, and I mean, we learned this in this process, like we learned the stats, like if you manage to just get past 90 days, like you're like in the top 1% of podcasters ever to exist. So, the bar is actually fairly low. If you just stick with it for a little while, you can be in the 1%,
All right. Well, with that, gents, I truly enjoy doing this podcast with you. I'm looking forward to continuing to doing a lot more episodes. And also want to thank everybody who's, been listening and been a part of this journey with us so far. We're really just getting started in this process, and getting better every day at putting out content for you guys to really help you fortify your brand on Amazon and beyond. So stay tuned. There's going to be a lot more exciting things to come.